The Langston estate was as silent as it was opulent. 30,000 square feet of polished marble, imported art and climate-controlled tranquility. But behind the thick walls of that Greenwich mansion, the quiet wasn't peace. It was distance. Richard Langston stood at the edge of the balcony in his master bedroom, sipping from a crystal glass that held more ice than bourbon. The late morning sun touched the tops of the trees with gold, but he barely noticed. Below, a gardener trimmed the hedges with military precision. "Mr. Langston," a voice called faintly from behind. He turned. Gloria, the house manager, stood politely at the door. "Yes. Your son is in the West Lounge. Says it's urgent." Richard's brow furrowed. "Is Evelyn back yet?" "No, sir. She left early. Pilates and then lunch at the club." He nodded absently and walked down the long hallway lined with photos from decades of charity galas and magazine covers. A family frozen in the illusion of warmth. The West Lounge smelled of cigar smoke and whatever cologne Chase had doused himself in that morning. His son, 28 and always dressed like an ad for yacht ownership, stood near the window, scrolling through his phone. "Could have texted me, you know," Richard said as he entered. "Texts are for assistance," Chase replied, not looking up. "This is real." Richard waited. Chase finally put the phone down. "There's chatter on the street. People saying you're liquidating assets. Pulling out of the Vegas deal. What's going on?" Richard sat slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. "I am liquidating. I'm stepping back." Chase laughed, short and bitter. "Bullshit. You don't step back. You control, you build, you dominate." "I'm tired, Chase." "Tired?" Chase leaned forward. "Dad, you built $1 billion empire. We're acquiring 2 new complexes this quarter alone. You don't get to be tired." Richard looked at his son and realized, truly realized, he didn't know this man. "I'm doing this," he said simply. "I need to." "Is this about Mom? About that stupid charity school she keeps talking about?" Richard didn't respond. Chase scoffed. "Whatever. Just don't drag the rest of us down with you." He left the room without another word. That evening, Evelyn returned, hair immaculate, sunglasses still on though the sun had set. "Pilates?" Richard asked quietly as she dropped her designer bag on the couch. "And lunch," she said. "Then I visited Matt. She's filming some makeup review for, I don't know. It's hard to keep up." He watched her carefully. The way she barely touched the floor when she walked. How she never quite looked him in the eye anymore. "I want to sell the company," he said. She didn't respond right away. Removed her shoes first. "Saturday." "You've said that before." "I mean it this time." "Why?" "Because I don't know who any of you are anymore. And I'm not sure you know me either." She tilted her head, like he'd told a joke she didn't understand. Then her phone buzzed and she looked away. 2 days later, Madison arrived in a fury of Chanel and entitlement. Her heels echoed through the marble foyer. "Dad," she whined, arms crossed. "What the hell is going on? Page 6 says we're bankrupt." Richard barely raised his head from the newspaper. "Do I look bankrupt to you? You always look like that. All calm and unbothered." "It's annoying." "It's a skill," he said. "Do I need to cut down my influencer deals? Like, am I supposed to start being relatable now?" Her voice cracked with disgust on that last word. "No," he said. "You should start being a person." She stared at him, confused. What does that even mean? But Richard said nothing else. By the end of the week, the plan was in motion. Whispers of investigations into Langston Realty began to swirl. Rumors of offshore accounts, creative accounting, shell companies in the Caymans. The media, once obsessed with Richard's every real estate triumph, now turned ravenous. His longtime lawyer, Daniel Weissman, handled the choreography of the fall. Fake subpoenas, public statements, briefings to key journalists who owed him favors. "Once the news drops, they'll all run," Daniel had warned. "That's the idea," Richard said. And they did. Overnight, the Langstons became toxic. Partners pulled out of joint ventures. Country clubs revoked honorary memberships. The New York Times ran a profile titled, "The Rise and Collapse of a Real Estate King." Chase gave a press conference alone, declaring he had nothing to do with the financial mismanagement and was no longer professionally affiliated with Langston Realty Holdings. Days later, he moved to a penthouse in Miami. Madison posted a tearful video claiming her father's choices didn't define her. Richard watched it on an old iPad while sitting on a lawn chair in the empty living room. She'd used a glitter filter. Evelyn took longer. She paced. She asked questions. "Is there any way to fix this? Are we going to be arrested?" Do we really have to leave the house? When Richard proposed the small brownstone in Brooklyn, she went silent for a full minute. Then simply said, "I need time." She was gone for 5 days. On the 6th, there was a knock at the Brooklyn door. Richard opened it and saw Evelyn, makeup-free, her hair pulled back. A modest coat, one suitcase. And in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in years. "I sold my rings," she said. "Closed the joint account." "You didn't have to." "I know." He stepped aside and she entered. "If the world turned its back on you," she said, turning to face him, "I'm not gonna be one more." That night, in the tiny kitchen where the faucet still dripped, they sat with mugs of instant coffee. "You really gave it all up," she said. Richard nodded. "I thought I married an empire," she added. "But you disappeared and left me with the ghost of a man I used to know." "I thought that man was gone too," he whispered. Evelyn looked at him, something tight in her throat. "Then maybe we both get a second chance." He reached for her hand. And for the first time in years she didn't pull away. The brownstone in Brooklyn was a far cry from the Langston estate. Its brick walls creaked when the wind blew hard, the floor tilted ever so slightly in the hallway, and the kitchen windows fogged up every morning from the poor insulation. But Evelyn Langston made the bed every day with hospital corners and placed a chipped porcelain sugar bowl in the center of their tiny dining table like it was baccarat crystal. She didn't complain. Not once. That, more than anything, unnerved Richard. He was used to her silence, yes, but it had always been the kind that hovered in cold luxury, not this quiet maid of choice and grit. She had been in this new life for only 3 weeks, yet it seemed she'd shed the old one overnight. One morning he found her on the stoop talking to a teenage boy who lived 2 doors down. "You want eggs?" she asked as Richard came out, holding a paper grocery bag. "Sure," he said, watching her. The boy jogged off, grinning. "What was that about?" Richard asked once they were alone. "He asked me if I knew how to make eggs that don't taste like rubber." I said yes. Richard paused. "You're making breakfast for the neighbors now?" Evelyn gave him a look. "He's alone most mornings. His mom leaves at 6 to clean houses. And it's just eggs." He nodded slowly, unsure if he admired her or felt exposed by her kindness. Later that week, Evelyn sat at the dining table with a stack of printed papers. Her reading glasses slid to the edge of her nose. "You're applying for a job?" Richard asked. "Substitute teacher," she replied. "Public school. Bronx." He blinked. "You haven't worked since." "Since I was 23. "I know." She didn't wait for his approval. Just circled a date on the calendar and moved on. On her first day of work, she wore flat shoes and a coat from a consignment shop. Richard walked her to the subway station. She hadn't asked, but he went anyway. They stood in silence, watching the turnstiles. "You nervous?" he finally asked. "Terrified," she said. Then laughed, soft and honest. "I haven't had to prove myself to anyone in 2 decades." Richard swallowed. "You always had something to prove. I just wasn't watching." Evelyn looked at him, expression unreadable, then stepped through the gate and disappeared down the stairs. The days fell into a rhythm neither of them expected. Evelyn returned every evening smelling of whiteboard markers and cafeteria pizza. She had stories about kids with brilliant minds and holes in their shoes, about underpaid teachers with second jobs as Uber drivers, about a school social worker who spent her lunch break braiding a girl's hair so she wouldn't be teased. She cried once. Quietly in the bathroom. Richard heard her but said nothing. The next morning he made coffee before she woke up. It was the first time in 14 years he'd done that. Meanwhile, the outside world seemed to forget them. Chase made appearances at Miami art galas, photographed beside models and young tech CEOs. Madison launched a lifestyle brand called Raw Luxury and gave an interview where she said, "Money can disappear, but elegance is forever." Neither of them called. Evelyn noticed. But she didn't say anything. Not even when her birthday passed quietly, marked only by a cheap bouquet from the corner store and a homemade cake Richard had Googled the recipe for. She smiled when she saw it. "It's burnt," she said. "I know," he admitted. She took a bite. "Still better than any cake from Pierre's." He laughed and she laughed with him, and for a brief second the air between them felt like something sacred. One night, a freezing wind slammed against the building. The radiator clanged like it might burst. Evelyn came home late, cheeks red, hands shaking. "You're frozen," Richard said, reaching for her coat. "I stopped to help someone," she said, pulling off her gloves. "A woman and her daughter. She got evicted today." Richard frowned. "What kind of help?" Evelyn hesitated, then pulled a thin envelope from her purse. Inside was nearly half the cash they had left in their emergency fund. He stared at it. "Evie, we need that money." "So does she." There was no drama in her voice. No self-righteousness. Just the calm conviction of someone who'd finally chosen who she wanted to be. "She's sleeping in a church basement with a 4-year-old. No coat. No food. I gave them something for a few nights. That's all." Richard didn't speak for a long time. The humiliation of needing to count dollars, of not being able to control the narrative, burned inside him like acid. But Evelyn simply made tea, pulled on wool socks, and sat near the radiator. "You're not angry?" he finally asked. "I've been angry for years," she replied. "This isn't that." That night Richard couldn't sleep. He got up around 2 a.m. and wandered into the hallway. The boxes Evelyn had packed when she moved in were still half open. He crouched beside one, lifted a lid, and saw something wrapped in a silk scarf. He unfolded it carefully. A leather-bound notebook. Handwritten. With her name on the first page. He hesitated. Then opened it. Page after page of Evelyn's thoughts, dated and detailed, years of unsaid words. "I cried in the back seat of the Bentley after he missed my birthday again. I smiled at the fundraiser. Everyone said we looked so in love. I don't think I felt love in months. He called me beautiful tonight. I think he meant it. I wish I could trust it. I lost the baby today. He was in Tokyo. I didn't tell him." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. He read for an hour. Then 2. A version of Evelyn emerged from those pages, not polished and composed but bruised, overlooked, and still hoping. Hope. That was the worst of it. She kept hoping. Even when he gave her every reason not to. In the morning he made her breakfast. Real breakfast, pancakes, eggs, coffee, exactly how she liked it. She stared at the spread. "What's this?" "I read something last night," he said, voice hoarse. "Something I should have read a long time ago." She froze. "My diary?" He nodded. Evelyn sat down slowly. "You shouldn't have." "I know. But I did. And now I see you. Really see you." She didn't cry. Didn't shout. Just looked at him with a stillness that spoke of oceans. "I stayed," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't have to. But I did." He reached for her hand across the table. "And I'll never take that for granted again." Richard had thought the most painful thing would be losing everything he built. It wasn't. The pain was quiet and slow. It came in whispers, not crashes. It was hearing Evelyn sigh in the middle of the night and knowing it wasn't because she was tired. It was watching her read by the window, not telling him about her day anymore. It was realizing, finally, that the version of her he had known for 26 years was only half the truth. The real Evelyn had lived behind a veil of patience. And now that veil had been lifted. A week after reading the diary, Richard bought a notebook of his own. He filled it, day by day, with things he should have said years ago. Not love letters. Apologies. Observations. Pieces of her he'd missed. How she laughed differently with the neighborhood kids. How she leaned into pain instead of avoiding it. How her silence now wasn't resignation but strength. He started carrying the notebook with him. Evelyn never asked what he was writing. Maybe she knew. Maybe she was waiting. One Friday night she came home with a black eye. "What happened?" Richard asked, rushing to her. "It was a fight between 2 students," she said calmly, icing her cheek. "I stepped between them." "You shouldn't have to do that." "No," she agreed. "But I did." There was a long pause. "Why are you doing this, Evelyn?" he asked quietly. "Because I spent years doing nothing," she said. "And I hated what I became." He looked at her. "You were never nothing to me." She met his gaze, her voice low and steady. "You didn't have to say it. You showed it." The words hit like a slap. The next day Richard took the subway alone to Midtown. Walked past his old office, now covered in for lease signs. It looked like a ghost had walked out of it and taken all the air with him. He had Daniel meet him at a cafe nearby. The lawyer looked older. Nervous. "They still think you're abroad," Daniel said. "If you want to resume control, we'll need a statement. A press conference. A rebranding." "I'm not coming back." Daniel blinked. "Excuse me? I don't want the company. I want the truth." The lawyer leaned in. "What truth?" Richard opened his own notebook and slid it across the table. "I want this printed. Publicly. My confession. My mistakes. What I did to my family. The fraud was fake, but the betrayal wasn't." Daniel went pale. "You're telling the world you lied?" "I'm telling the world I wasn't a man worth admiring. But I'm becoming one." When he got home, Evelyn was already asleep. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her breathe, wrapped in the same gray blanket she refused to replace even though it had holes. He thought of the mansion's 2,000 thread count sheets, the imported furniture, the gallery walls, and how none of it had ever held her like this broken little room did. 2 days later he cooked dinner, pasta burned at the bottom but she still ate it. Afterward, they sat on the stoop in silence, watching the lights flicker across the windows of the building opposite. A child screamed with laughter in the distance. Someone played jazz upstairs. "I read the last page of your diary," Richard said suddenly. Evelyn didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. "You wrote, 'If he ever truly sees me, I'll know it's real. I'll know it's not too late.'" Silence. "I see you, Evelyn." Her lip trembled. She shook her head, laughing softly through her nose. "That page was 5 years old, Richard." "I know. But I only read it last week." She looked down at her hands. "I stopped writing after that." "Why?" "Because I didn't think you'd ever see it. And I didn't want to keep writing to a ghost." Richard reached into his coat and pulled out his notebook. "I've been writing to the woman who stayed." She took it, her fingers brushing his. The next day, a storm hit the city, thunder cracking over Brooklyn like gunshots. Evelyn stayed home, wrapped in her blanket, reading Richard's notebook. He pretended to work but watched her the entire time. When she reached the last page, she closed the book slowly. "You wrote? I would have failed as a man if she never knew I read her pain and tried to become worthy of it." Richard nodded. "And you mean that?" she asked. "I meant every word." Her eyes shimmered. She stood and walked over, placed the notebook on his chest and said, "Then I forgive you." A week later, he invited her to dinner, not in Manhattan, but a quiet corner of Harlem where the lights were dim and the music was soft. Evelyn wore a dress that cost $20. She looked like a queen. The food was simple. Fried chicken, collard greens, sweet tea. They laughed through most of it. Talked about students, neighbors, nothing at all. Then Richard placed a small envelope on the table. "What's this?" she asked, suspicious. "Not a trick. Just something real." She opened it. Inside, a deed. A new property in her name. Not an estate. Not a palace. A small farmhouse in Martha's Vineyard. With it, a bank statement. $100 million. All under her control. And a letter. "Evelyn, this is not a reward. It's not an apology. It's a thank you. For seeing me. For staying. I built an empire, but I destroyed a home. You rebuilt both, with nothing but your hands and your heart. This is yours. You are my greatest investment. R." She folded the letter, eyes wet, and looked at him across the candlelight. "You know," she said, voice cracking, "I fell in love with you when you had nothing." He swallowed. "And now I know, that's still all I needed." Outside, the city pulsed around them. Sirens, chatter, whined through the gutters. But inside, in that tiny restaurant, Richard Langston, once a giant, finally felt small in the best way. He took her hand. She didn't pull away. Not this time. Not ever again. The story broke on a rainy Thursday. Former real estate mogul faked bankruptcy in social experiment. Wife emerges as the heart of the story. The media erupted. Cable networks debated whether it was fraud or performance art. Op-eds called it everything from a billionaire's midlife crisis to a social critique disguised as a lie. But buried under the headlines was something rarer, awe. Not for Richard. For Evelyn. Photos surfaced of her walking to the Bronx school in thrift store coats, standing beside her students, comforting a crying mother. The press dubbed her, the woman who stayed. That night, Richard turned off the television. "Is it strange?" he asked. "Seeing yourself like that?" Evelyn didn't look away from her tea. "They're not wrong. But they're also late." He nodded. "Too late?" "No," she said. "Just late enough." Madison called 2 days later. Her name flashed on the screen for 5 full rings before Richard picked up. "Dad." Her voice cracked, uncertain. Not the rehearsed tone he knew from her videos. "I saw the interview. The photos. Mom?" "She's the same woman she's always been," Richard said softly. There was silence. Then, "I didn't know. You didn't want to." Pause. "I want to now." She came to Brooklyn the next day, standing awkwardly in the doorway in leggings and oversized sunglasses, her usual glam replaced with quiet humility. Evelyn hugged her without a word. Richard watched from the hallway as they sat at the kitchen table, their heads bowed over mugs of peppermint tea. Later that night, Madison asked to stay over. "I forgot what it felt like to be in a home that didn't echo," she whispered. Chase came last. He didn't call. He showed up. In a suit too clean for the neighborhood, with a driver awkwardly parked in a no-standing zone. Richard opened the door. "You've been watching," he said simply. Chase nodded. "I thought you'd lost your mind." "I did," Richard replied. "A long time ago. I just didn't notice." Chase glanced around the narrow hallway at the peeling paint, at the framed picture of Evelyn with her students. "This isn't you." "It is now." Chase took a deep breath. "I want to start over." "Then take off the suit," Richard said, stepping aside. "And stay for dinner." Over the following weeks, the family began to unlearn everything that had once defined them. Dinners became sacred, even if it was soup and crackers. Evelyn made each person say one thing they were grateful for. Madison always went last. Her answers were never what Richard expected. "I'm grateful Mom didn't give up on me. I'm grateful I had to start over. I'm grateful for silence, real silence. Not the cold kind." Chase, too, changed in ways Richard couldn't have imagined. He took long walks with Evelyn, talking about childhood memories that had been buried under ambition and boarding school. He asked questions, the kind Richard had never thought he'd hear from him. "What was I like as a baby? What made you and Mom fall in love? Did you ever regret building the company instead of staying home more?" To all of it, Richard answered honestly. "Yes. Yes, I regret it." One Sunday, Evelyn invited her colleagues from the school for dinner. They arrived with baked casseroles, banana pudding, and stories. Richard grilled burgers out back in the tiny yard, surrounded by folding chairs and laughter. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought cheap wine. The night ended with children asleep on couches and Evelyn dancing barefoot in the kitchen. That night, lying in bed, she said, "This is the life I didn't know I needed." Richard looked at her. "And the life I never thought I deserved." Daniel called the next morning. "There's a motion to investigate the hoax," he said. "It won't stick, but it's noise." "I can handle noise," Richard replied. Daniel hesitated. "They want you back, Richard. Investors. Developers. People are watching. This could be the comeback of the decade." "I already came back," Richard said. "Just not where they expected." "You're serious about walking away?" "Dead serious." Daniel sighed. "And Evelyn? She doesn't want the world. She wants a garden. Maybe a dog." "Well," Daniel muttered, "that's one hell of a woman." Richard smiled. "I know." Spring arrived in quiet colors, tulips pushing through sidewalk cracks, children drawing chalk suns on the pavement. Evelyn found joy in teaching a poetry unit, and Richard began volunteering at a community center, helping young adults write resumes and prep for job interviews. Sometimes people recognized him. "Are you?" "I was," he'd say with a small smile. "Now I'm just Richard." The farmhouse in Martha's Vineyard sat untouched until May. When they arrived, it smelled of dust and new wood. Evelyn walked through every room in silence. Richard followed her, waiting. In the upstairs bedroom, she opened a closet and found a stack of empty journals, fresh, blank pages. She turned to him. "You kept them here for me? I thought you might want to write again." She pressed a hand to her chest, her voice breaking. "I think I do." They spent weekends painting walls, planting lavender, hosting neighbors they didn't know but quickly came to love. Madison brought her camera, capturing photos not for followers but for herself. Chase spent hours by the sea drawing plans for something new, something not meant to impress but to serve. One afternoon, Richard found Evelyn sitting on the porch, flipping through her old diary. "You all right?" he asked. She looked up, smiling softly. "It's strange. I thought these pages were the end. But now they feel like the beginning." And they were. Because falling isn't failure, not when you rise into something better. Not when you rise together. 1 year later, no one would have believed where Richard Langston ended up. Not if they'd only ever known him from headlines, boardrooms, or the mythos of Langston Realty. But the people in Martha's Vineyard didn't care about empires. They knew him as the man who helped repair the town library's leaking roof, who walked with his wife to the market every Saturday, who waved at every passing cyclist like they were old friends. Sometimes they'd ask about the scandal, the fall, the lie. He'd just smile and say, "That story ended. This one's better." The farmhouse had grown into something unexpected, not bigger, just fuller. The garden now bloomed with vegetables and wildflowers. Evelyn spent hours with her hands in the dirt, humming songs she used to only listen to in secret. She still taught part-time remotely, helping under-resourced schools design new curricula. The woman who once wore diamonds at charity galas now wore rubber boots and a straw hat, and somehow she was more radiant than ever. Richard knew. He saw her now. He never stopped seeing her. Madison visited often. Her lifestyle brand had quietly folded. No announcement. No drama. Instead, she was taking classes at a nearby college, psychology and community development. She asked questions that had weight now, not angles. At dinner one night, she confessed something that stuck with Richard. "You know why I was so obsessed with the perfect image?" she said, slicing into a peach. He shook his head. "Because I thought if everything looked perfect, no one would notice how unhappy we were." Richard felt the sting of truth but didn't flinch. "And now?" he asked. She smiled. "Now I want to know what happy actually feels like. For real." Chase had started a mentorship program in New Haven for first-generation college students. He came down on weekends, sleeves rolled up, eyes clearer than Richard remembered. One evening, as they were grilling by the fire pit, Chase handed Richard a folder. "What's this?" Richard asked. "A business plan." "For what?" "A nonprofit. Real estate training. Free. Focused on underserved communities." Richard raised an eyebrow. "And you want funding?" Chase shook his head. "No. I want your blessing." Richard opened the folder, scanned the first page and smiled. "You already have it." Evelyn, meanwhile, had begun writing again. Not in the old diary but in a new one, with green covers and pages stained from lavender-scented hands. She didn't let Richard read it. "Not yet. Maybe someday," she said, eyes twinkling. "For now, it's just mine." That was fine with him. Some things weren't meant to be shared. Not until they were ready. On their wedding anniversary, Richard surprised her. He led her to a quiet meadow behind the farmhouse, where 2 wooden chairs faced the setting sun. A small table between them. A single envelope resting on it. "You wrote me another letter?" she asked. "No," he said. "You did." She opened it, confused. Inside was a page, a copy of her old diary entry. The last one. "If he ever truly sees me, I'll know it's real. I'll know it's not too late." But beneath it, Richard had written one final line. "I see you. I always will." She pressed the letter to her chest and turned to him. "I stayed," she said again. "I know," he whispered. "And I came back." They sat together, hand in hand, as the sky turned gold and then violet and then a quiet shade of blue. No empire. No audience. Just them. That night, as they lay in bed, Evelyn asked, "Do you miss any of it?" "The business?" "No. The noise." He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I miss this more. I just didn't know it." In the months that followed, people came to know the Langstons differently. Not as a cautionary tale. Not as a scandal. But as something rare. A family that broke and chose to heal. Richard began speaking, not on stages but in classrooms and community halls. He told his story plainly. Not to inspire. Just to be honest, he'd end every talk the same way. "I spent my life mastering the art of acquisition. I knew how to win, how to grow, how to conquer. But no one ever taught me how to be still. How to love. How to stay. My wife did." On a quiet September morning, Evelyn handed him her newest journal. "You can read it," she said. "All of it." He sat under the tree they planted together and read until the sun dipped low. Inside were pages of grace, of heartbreak, of survival, but also of peace. In the final entry she'd written, "We lost millions but found each other. I used to think we were broken. But maybe we were just buried under too much. And maybe love isn't loud or glamorous or Instagram perfect. Maybe it's just this, a man who finally listens and a woman who chooses to speak." The last line of her journal read, "Some stories are built with steel and glass. Ours was built with silence, forgiveness and finally, truth." Richard closed the book. And for the first time in his life he felt whole.